O Parlamento da União Europeia...
So the European Parliament approved at the end of January by majority the initiative report on access to decent and affordable housing for all, by the rapporteur Kim Van Sparrentak. This is an historical step for the EU agenda. The Lisbon Tenants Association AIL, in articulation with the International Union of Tenants IUT, is disclosing this big conquest in the media, civil society, and with our politicians. And that is why we are celebrating our 97th anniversary. And we thought it would be a good idea to invite the rapporteur, and then we could move on and to present the report, and then we could carry on to a debate. So good afternoon, my name is Luís Mendes. I'm the member of the Lisbon Tenants Association. I'll be your moderator today. So this report is an historical moment for the right to housing and European citizenship for two reasons. First of all, because the European Union finally recognizes on its agenda the question of housing as a human right and affordable for everybody. And so this, given that the European Union makes policies in this age, and so it hands over this portfolio to the member states, and so they are responsible, for example, in terms of the national policies. So the question that is approved by the MEPs appeals the member states to promote this, and the European Commission drew up this report, this initiative, and it puts forward legislative and financial measures that are appropriate to be agreed upon by the member states. And so to start our ceremony, I think that we could give the floor to the president of the Lisbon Tenants Association, Mr. Romão Lavradinho. Thank you very much, Luís. And first of all, I would like to send my very special greetings to all the participants of this initiative, which is very important for the Tenants Association, for Portugal and for Europe. And so this is what we're doing today. We are celebrating the fact that our association is 97 years old, and which was very important during the period of the Estado Novo, when fascism, when we had a normal activity. Despite the situation in Portugal, tenants had great difficulty in being able to claim whatever because of the political situation in Portugal. Obviously, after the 25th of April 1974, the revolution and democracy, we considered it important that we continue to demand what we've always done. And so our association, over these 7 years of existence, has always made its demands, and it's very important for us to, in Portugal, have this association. So there are 97 years that we've been around, and I'd say the following. So throughout these years, our activity has been carried out on behalf of tenants, intervening in all constitutional governments that came to exist from the 25th of April to today. We've made a number of proposals to the government about the possibility for tenants to have more advantages and to suffer less. And so we think we have, with Mr. Ribeirinho knows our position, and Dr. Paula knows exactly what our positions are in the Town Council. And so we have had a very important, significant intervention for the Portuguese tenants and for their rights. However, we have carried out a very special activity in our organization. We have claimed the alteration of the rent law in order to give more rights to tenants. Since 1990, last year, the tenants lost their rights, and they have been losing their rights every year. And so with the current government, we have managed to introduce a number of alterations, and the one which I consider very important at the moment, that is the question of the PRR to be considered for a support to housing and renting housing. And so we think that this document was approved, in the European Union on access to a decent and affordable housing. I think that this is going to show that there are many countries in Europe that have the same problem that exists in Portugal. The tenants suffer a great deal from the fact that there is no real rent market, housing market. And so in 2019, there was a housing law approved, and we consider it very important because finally it is going to the government to accepted its responsibilities in relation to Portuguese families. And this is very important because Portuguese families now and the middle class does not have access to housing, or they're very small because the rents are far too high. And so we're talking about 1,100, 1,500 euros for the middle or low middle class in Portugal is impossible. And so we are claiming this with the government, and we think that the government could help to solve this problem. And as the more market for renting houses, then the public authorities will solve the problem of speculation. We think that real estate, the property speculation has increased because the Portuguese state has never managed to solve this problem of renting. If in Portugal, public housing are 2% of the total housing, whereas in most European countries, especially in the north of Europe, housing represents 25-30%. And so this is a solution that we think that could solve the problems if, in fact, and now I'd like to call your attention to the Secretary of State, if, in fact, we increase this to 25,000 contract, 25,000 renters contracts. And so I had the news from the Secretary of State saying that these numbers are not do not represent reality. Well, not the 26,000 missing. These contracts are missing. We're talking about 40,000. So just in the metropolitan areas of Lisbon, the situation is serious, and so this is a solution that could solve the problem. I would also like to say that this question of speculation is only altered and is only going to be decreased if, in fact, as I've just said, if, in fact, the state has a housing market that could help solve the problem of tenants with affordable rents, as the Constitution says. And so the rent must be in accordance with the income of households. And so, as you know, in Portugal, the income is very low. We're talking about 600 euros, the minimum wage. So a family or a couple that has the minimum wage cannot pay a rent of 1,100 euros or 1,200. Well, friends, thank you very much for your participation. And through this conference, if necessary, I will put forward a number more solutions and my opinions. Thank you very much for your work. Thank you very much, Roman. I would now like to give the floor to the President of the International Union of Tenants, Marie-Linda. Welcome.
Sorry. Thank you very much for bringing me to this event. I'm Marie-Linda. I am the president of the International Union of Tenants. And I also want to say happy birthday for your 97th birthday as AIL. Sometimes I think you are almost 100 years. I also represent a Swedish tenants organization who is 100 years old. Really, we shouldn't be we shouldn't be needed in 2021, because it should be like that everyone had affordable housing in the whole world. We started 100 years ago because people did have lack of housing, the tenants needed rights. But the situation right now all over the world is that we are needed. We are needed for affordable housing. We are needed because there are overcrowding. We are needed because there are renovictions. We are needed that even though there's a pandemic going on, people are getting evicted from their houses. So I'm very glad that you have this event tonight, and I think it's important that we still continues to work for tenants' rights. We need to organize, but we also need to see that the states, the politicians, take responsible for affordable housing for everyone. And I hope that the Portuguese Presidency of the European Commission will take lead in this good situation about take lead in the housing for all, because the good report that Kim Van Sparrentak has presented for the Parliament and that has been also voted for the Parliament is a lead to take the question further on. I think it's important when we come out of the pandemic that we all will put the focus on housing for all, stop of renovictions and evictions, and instead talking about how can we make affordable housing for all people, not just Europe, all around the world, but tonight it's the question of Europe. So I wish you a good evening, because this is fantastic with internet. I'm in a debate of housing in the south of Sweden right now. So I have just changed my computer, but I can tell you there are people talking about the rights of not getting evicted when the house is going to be renovated, and that is the debate I was in right now. But I wish you a good evening. I'm very glad that you have this event with all these prominent guests, and I wish you a very good debate and a happy birthday to your organization so much.
Muito obrigado, Marie. E agora passaria.
Thank you very much, Marie. And to conclude this, these welcoming speeches, I'd like to give the floor to the Secretary of State for Housing. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having invited me to be part of this excellent panel. I'm going to learn a lot more than I'm going to be able to share with you about the practices in Portugal. And no doubt this will be an excellent contribution for not only for today, but to continue our work. I'm not going to talk too much now because I would like to hear a little bit about the report. So later we can talk about it. But I would just like to say that the role of the association is the promotion of public policies in our special area. And it's true that it is not a positive fact that we depend on these associations to guarantee the rights of the rights to housing, because that means that things are not as they should be. But the right to housing we've been working in this area for decades now, and so hopefully we'll be able to guarantee the right to housing sometime in the future. So maybe I could talk about this later, but I would like to begin by saying that I totally agree with the role of the state and the importance of the state to safeguard the right to housing, not only guaranteeing the protection of the tenants, which of course there must be a balance in there, but we actually know which side has more power in this situation of this time. And so we are protecting the right to housing. So I would like to complement this with what our major priority is, that is the state have an active role in this, that is through public housing and this is the work that we're actually doing. And so I'm sure that we will move forward in the right direction. And this is obviously something that can be done from one day to another, but we need short-term instruments that allow us to match this medium-term objective with the immediate need to find housing for the population. But I would like to begin to launch the debate to say that these are our major priorities, and I would like to thank and congratulate the association for its anniversary and for the work that they've had and the help that they have given us in the public policies, public housing policies. And then maybe later on we can talk about the role of the state and the responsibility it has in the right to housing later. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Sra. Secretária de Estado. Bom, então chegamos ao ponto em que vamos todos conhecer o relatório. Kim Van Sparrentak, bem-vinda.
To get to know the report, Kim Van Sparrentak, a member of the European Free Alliance. She's been a rapporteur in a series of reports, but now she played a decisive role in this report, and also in relation to a very similar topic, which is very dear to this question, which is Airbnb, the short rental, short-term rental. I know that you have been dealing in this topic. You have been a rapporteur of this very important and controversial report. So I'm passing you the floor so that in the next couple of minutes you will tell us a bit about this report. Thank you. Thank you, Kim, for having accepted our invitation.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to your anniversary, and yeah, happy birthday, I guess. It's really an honor to be able to present my report to you tonight. You know, the reason we decided to write this report is the fact that so many Europeans are finding themselves in a very difficult situation when it comes to housing. You know, there's lots of people struggling to pay rent or to afford their mortgages, and too many people are losing their home, and too many people are sleeping rough. We already decided to write this report in September 2019, which means that there was not even any sign of COVID happening. And already back then, we could say that we had a housing crisis all over Europe. Over 80 million people in the EU were then overburdened by housing costs. In the last decade, of course, the number of homeless people in Europe has risen by 70%, and any night more than 700,000 people were sleeping rough in Europe before the pandemic. We don't know the actual numbers now, but we're pretty sure that these numbers have only increased. And the COVID-19 crisis and the need to go into lockdown has really, you know, made the need to provide adequate and affordable housing even more clear than it already was. Because if sheltering in place is the best way to prevent becoming ill, we need to make sure that people's homes are decent and that they actually have one. And, you know, with the huge economic impact of the pandemic, we really need to ensure that people can keep sheltering in place and don't risk to lose their homes. So I think, you know, the European Parliament report comes at a very crucial time when we, first of all, need to solve the housing crisis, but also have to decide what kind of Europe we want to be and how we want to deal with the economic crisis and who we put on the forefront. In the writing of this report, I did a lot of research. I spoke with a lot of stakeholders, and what became clear to me is that European policies are sometimes better at making profit on housing than protecting the people who need a roof over their heads. In my analysis, this is because officially housing is not a European competence. And it's very easy to say housing is not a European competence, so we don't do anything about it. And we just don't pay so much attention to it. But the effect this has had is that there is policy that is affecting the housing market, which isn't considering really the effects on housing, but it's affecting, but only considering how it affects the market as is. So my call in the report is basically to start treating access to housing as a fundamental right again, and you know, just really acknowledging that housing is a human right and that we treat it as such, and that we don't accidentally make bad policies around housing anymore in Europe, but that we consciously improve the way that we deal with housing. So as I said, I spoke with many different stakeholders, and we try to encompass as many topics as possible in the report, because we realized that just writing a report about the role of social housing, for example, which had been done by the European Parliament before, wouldn't cut it anymore. The housing crisis is affecting everyone, whether you're young, whether you're old, whether you live in Athens, whether you live, you know, in Stockholm. Everywhere people are struggling to pay rent. And we also see a very clear intergenerational struggle, you know, young people staying longer at home because they can't afford a room. Then, you know, the students staying longer in their rooms because they can't move to a studio. Then, you know, people actually, you know, delaying having a family because they can't afford a family home. And then there's elderly people who would actually like to move to an apartment that is a bit more adjusted to them, a bit smaller after their kids have left the house, but they also can't afford that. The housing market is completely stuck and people are suffering from it, and we need to change that. So I would like to highlight 7 important points of my report in my presentation tonight. So one very important part of the report is that we are calling to set a European goal of eradicating homelessness by 2030. We are seeing that, you know, the amount of homeless people in Europe keeps on increasing, except for in one country, the country that set a goal to end homelessness, which is Finland. So apparently homelessness is not just a fact of life, it is a choice, and it's a choice to fix it or not fix it. And that's why we really think it's important to be ambitious, you know, really have a moonshot strategy, set a goal together with member states and civil society to eradicate homelessness by 2030. Because, you know, in the end, homelessness is just an extreme form of poverty, and it's completely unacceptable, and it's a breach of human rights. So we were really calling to have this in the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan, which was presented last week. And unfortunately, we see that the Commission has announced a collaboration platform, but hasn't put on homelessness, which we welcome. We think it's a very good initiative, but it misses the target. And we really think that we could have a sub-goal. There are several goals in the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan. Under the poverty goal, there could be a sub-target on ending homelessness. And very happy to have someone from the Portuguese Presidency here. So please take it into consideration. Yesterday, in my speech, I also called for this in the European Parliament when we were discussing the European Pillar of Social Rights. I know you have an EPSCO Council this coming Monday, so perhaps it could be part of your agenda. So next to that, I think that in the report, we really made it clear how we see that we should work on eradicating homelessness. And this is really a prioritization of housing homeless people using a housing first strategy, which is the strategy they use in Finland, which is giving people a home. But next to that, we really have to make sure that member states stop criminalizing the homeless, because this is happening, for example, in Hungary, and it's just an incredible violation of human rights. Secondly, we did, especially in the draft report, but I think also in the final report, perhaps not as strong wording as I would have liked to see, we're asking to take action to fight evictions and create more inclusive housing markets. You know, we really see that there's a rising financialization of the housing market, which of course has also been very much pushed forward by Leilani, and I think we should really thank her for putting this high on the agenda. We see the buy-to-let system, institutional investments by means of real estate shares and foreign capital, and buy-to-leave schemes. And you see actually that more and more housing is treated as a tradable asset to make profits with. And, you know, we saw that the Blackstone investment group, for example, already communicated at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, it provides them with a great opportunity to invest more and make more profits. And EU policies in different domains have an important impact on this evolution. And I really think that the EU has to step up its game, and that's what we call for. We really hope also that the European Commission will do more research in seeing, you know, how they can actually counter this financialization. In the report, we also propose that member states and local authorities put in place better tax measures to counter speculative investments. We need to better protect mortgage borrowers against evictions and ensure that there's transparency on real estate ownerships, because now you see that many tenants don't even know who hides behind the investment scheme and sort of is their landlord, which means it's very difficult for them to, you know, ask for things to be fixed, for example, in their houses. And also, you know, if you have more an anonymous landlord, you know, it's easier to feel a bit more detached from the ownership. So I think it's really important that we change this situation. Thirdly, I think we really need to increase Europe's affordable housing stock. There is an investment gap in affordable housing in Europe of 57 billion per year. I mean, this is just an incredible amount of money, and this is related with European policies, because we see that there are several policies that are actually hampering member states in investing in housing. So first of all, we really would like to see the Commission to adapt the target group definition of social and publicly funded housing in the rules on services of general economic interest, because this would enable regions and local authorities to build more social housing and provide it to a wider group of people. The current definition is way too restrictive. It means in the Netherlands that you are not able to give social housing to someone who is a teacher, for example, because they would have too high income. And I think, you know, member states and local authorities should really decide upon themselves whether they want to provide housing for these people and shouldn't be left to the market because the EU says so. And then I think it's very important that we also look at the Stability and Growth Pact. It really provides us with an opportunity to change the fiscal rules and make sure it is easier for member states to invest, for example, by changing the budget rules. Next to that, of course, we now have the Recovery Fund coming up, and it is possible for member states to really invest in affordable housing through the Recovery Fund. And I think it's very important that we really scrutinize the proposals from the member states on what they want to spend their recovery fund on, and really have a look on whether they try to also tackle the housing crisis in this. Then we really are calling for a very strong integrated European strategy on housing. You know, what I was talking about before, you know, that the European Union is very often hiding behind the fact that it has no competence on housing policy. But, you know, we can't just say that anymore, as we see that the macroeconomic and fiscal policy of the EU has such a huge impact on housing affordability. So we really want the EU to step up its game and make sure that the different policy fields that are perhaps not always the first ones that come to mind when we think of housing policy, it should be better integrated. Housing affordability also needs to be better reflected in the European semester, for example. And we also would like to see the reference threshold for the housing cost overburden rate to be set at no higher than 25%. Of course, I'm a green politician, so I also see opportunities in the European Green Deal. And we see that the renovation wave can play a huge role in, you know, providing healthy, adequate, and accessible housing and creating jobs. You know, we're having a health crisis right now. We're having a housing crisis. We're having an economic crisis. And all these things can be solved at once if we invest in making houses more sustainable and more healthy. We know that the people who are living in the worst housing are the ones that pay the highest energy bills and are suffering the most from energy poverty. But next to that, their health is also often poorer because you have a higher chance of having respiratory diseases. And if you have a respiratory disease, COVID can get you even worse if you're unlucky. So I think it's very important that we are conscious, about these interlinkages and the fact that, emission reductions through housing renovation is really important. And of course, the renovation wave is coming up. There will be funding available. And we really hope that, the Commission will really help the member states and guide them towards first helping the people that live in energy poverty and really prioritize renovating social housing. And then the topic you already mentioned, which is a topic that I've been working on quite a lot in both the Social Affairs Committee, in which I wrote this report, and the Internal Market Committee, where we cover the digital single market, Airbnb. We see this huge growth of short-term holiday rental, and Airbnb is really not the bed and breakfast, the cute air mattress that you put in a room in your house, where you have someone over and you can charge them a little bit of money and you make a friend, as the Airbnb owners always claim to do. I think it's very important to recognize the fact that cities don't have any control anymore about who, is renting out their houses. And also, we see more and more that it's just huge investors that create illegal hotels rather than someone just renting out their house for a while. We are calling in this report to make sure that the Commission takes on board provisions to make sure that cities can actually regulate what is happening in their cities. But we've already spoken a lot with the Commission also about this before. They proposed the Digital Services Act, and I'm very happy to see that they actually, in the Digital Services Act, took into consideration this issue. And they want to give more obligations to platforms, for example, by making sure that if you have, a system in place, I can't come up with the word now, but a system in place with certificates for renting out your house as a holiday home, that you have to share, that you have to make sure that people that are subscribed to Airbnb actually register with the municipalities, and the municipality can check whether you are allowed to do so. And next to that, we also want Airbnb to be obligated to share information with local authorities if they need to. And it's so far it is in the Digital Services Act, this provision. Yeah, we are positive. We now just really hope that it stays in, because this was, of course, a proposal from the Commission and then the member states, and the Parliament have to get into the negotiations. I'm very glad to see that the country where I'm from, the Netherlands, has a very strong has played a very strong role in making sure that we can actually regulate Airbnb. And I have the feeling that there's a lot of very big cities that play an important role in lobbying their governments to make sure this stays in. And then lastly, the seventh point that is very dear to my heart and I think is very important is combating housing discrimination. We really have to make sure that we have equal treatment for all and non-discrimination in the search for affordable housing, because housing is a basic right for everyone. And we really have to make sure that the Commission uses infringement procedures against member states that are discriminating against population groups such as Roma. European standards and investment should contribute to accessible housing for people with disabilities. We now see very often that people with disabilities are, first of all, having a very hard time to find a home, and next to that, often it's very expensive. Making sure that we not only look at the people that perhaps look like the general politician or the average politician, but to everyone is very important. Okay, I think I have now explained most of my report. I'm very curious to hear if you have any questions. And yeah, I think the main call for us is treating housing as a fundamental right and not leaving it up to the market, because I think we've done the experiment of leaving it up to the market and it has failed. Yeah, and of course, Luis, in the beginning you said that it was quite controversial. It was indeed. There were some provisions in the report that some groups on the other side of the aisle of the parliament were not very happy with, but it was adopted with quite a good majority. So, thank
you. Kim, muito obrigado pela tua apresentação.
Thank you, Kim, for your presentation. We're going to pass the floor to our commentators, to our special guests, and I'd like to bring onto this panel and I'd like to ask Secretary of State and Romão and Marie, if she's still with us, to be a part of this discussion. Now, I'd like to pass the floor to Barbara. I'm really thrilled with Barbara Steinberger's presence in our discussion. Barbara has been a fundamental support for the networking that our Association of Lisbon Tenants has been carried out. She is from the International Union of Tenants. Since 2013, she's a member of the executive board of IUT. She's responsible for the representation of the interests of the tenant associations before the European Commission, the European Parliament. Barbara, it's a pleasure to have you with us. We have wonderful guest speakers, and this is an historical opportunity for tenants. So tell us about this a bit.
Thank you very much, Luis. A wonderful evening to everybody here in the debate, in the panel, but also outside on the screens. My first words, of course, congratulations for your 97th anniversary. 97 years of good work, necessary work to fight for the rights of tenants. And we are very happy and proud that we can do this together in our International Union of Tenants, because tenants are united across borders. And this is what we are talking today about. I think this is also a very topical moment. We have the Portuguese EU presidency. We have the initiative report of Kim Van Sparrentak, which she just presented. The very core issues that we have been asking for years are in there. And we have been very happy and honored also to contribute to some crucial points when it comes to tenant protection, right to housing, and security of tenure. So we are at the crossroads, and Portugal especially is at the crossroads. We just have now the possibility to sketch a post-pandemic housing policy. It has never been so far like we have been today. We have from the European Union the Resilience and Recovery Facility. Portugal will receive 28 billion euros. From this 28.6 billion euros, 15.7 are loans and 12.9 are grants. There is already a decision that of this recovery plans and facility money, 1.6 billion euro is going to affordable housing in Portugal. Well, this is good news, of course, but when you count it down, it is a little bit more than 5% of the overall recovery money, which is coming from the European Union. And I'm happy that Marina Gonçalves is here, so we can perhaps talk about this percentage and how we can make the best of the money that's coming from Euro now to Portugal. What is the situation? Why is this so important? Why are we at the crossroads? Well, it has been said already by Romão, the president of our Tenants Union of Lisbon. The public housing stock in Portugal, it's only 2%. We are at the end of the scala of Europe. There has been already a promise of the Portuguese government to sketch up this 2% to 5%, but unfortunately, we did not come so far yet. Perhaps now, this extra money coming from the European Union, there are new chances to reach the target of at least 5% social housing in Portugal. What else is happening? We have in Lisbon 3,000 empty apartments. This is 3% of the entire housing stock. We have all over Portugal 700,000 empty apartments. This is 15% of the entire housing stock. How can we mobilize these empty apartments? And I'm happy to present some ideas that we, the International Union of Tenants, has to mobilize these apartments and give them back to the market. We have thousands of evictions in Portugal. Per day, I repeat, per day, 5 families in Portugal are evicted. These are 5 families too much. We had a big social housing program in Portugal from the year 1995 until 2005. In total, 30,000 social housing units have been built, but they were not integrated in the urban fabric. They were outside, in the banlieues. We have, in 2019, finally made it to have the basic law for housing in Portugal. The problem is that it is still, unfortunately, not enforced. So we still lack security of tenure and protection of tenants' rights. We have a problem with the Portuguese building stock. The Portuguese building stock is not in a very good shape. It counts in total 17% of all the emission in Portugal, 17%. This has direct influence of the living situation of tenants. In total, 20% of the Portuguese households are not able to keep their house adequately warm. We are talking about severe energy poverty. This is a problem. So I think we are at the crossroads. We have a lot of things to do now. This is a critical situation, but also a situation of massive opportunities. I will give you some ideas, perhaps interesting to follow up. Well, we have the money of the resilience and recovery funds from the European Union. This money should definitely be used to set up a new social and affordable housing sector. Social and affordable, I do say this because we need social housing for the poor households, but we also need affordable housing for the middle incomes. This housing stock should be managed by not-for-profit entities. I think it is extremely important that we create an entire not-for-profit housing sector in Portugal, which is strong. We have 2%, we are striving for 5%. Of course, we have a very long way to go to have the 30% of the Netherlands. But anyhow, we have to go on and we have to fulfill this. Even the European Commission, who is not very well known as a social commission, says the social housing stock in Portugal is way too low in the country-specific recommendations. And Portugal will have to listen to the country-specific recommendations because, of course, there will be an evaluation of the use of the recovery funds money. Second idea, I think we have to mobilize the empty housing stock. The empty housing stock, it's very, very interesting because it is sometimes also located in inner city areas. In inner city areas where it is not easy to build en gros social and affordable housing because we have a massive scarcity of land. So when we mobilize this empty housing stock, and only in Lisbon, we have 3,000 empty apartments, we could house the people directly, which are now on the street when we mobilize it. And I think the money can be used from the recovery funds in a very ideal way. You can renovate those apartments which are run down, which do not have a very good energy efficiency standard. And then you, the city of Lisbon, and I'm very happy that Paula Marques is here, you are the new landlord and you can be a fair landlord with a fair rent, with rent caps, and you have the full housing allocation rights for all the people that are in desperate need of housing. I think it is very interesting to do this. And we have a model that is already very good and approved in many, many European countries. You can do that by so-called social rental agencies. So our proposal would be to set up such a social rental agency to mobilize the empty housing stock, not only in Lisbon, but all over Portugal, 700,000 empty units. Next idea. Very, very clearly, you are talking to a tenant union representative. No eviction without rehousing. This is an absolute no-go. Nobody has to be thrown out of the streets. We need immediate rehousing of people which are evicted. And we do have the basic housing law in Portugal since 2019. It is now the time, it is overdue, if you ask me, to make this housing law really enforceable, that the people have the right to be rehoused. This is, I think, an extremely important point. I think we have to also do something for a very special group of people. We definitely have to solve the question of housing for young people and young families in Portugal. And I have an idea. Okay, we have to dream a little bit, but everything is possible. We do see now that there are more and more regulations against Airbnb, which are fully justified, because Airbnb and all the other short-term rentals, they extract regular housing from the market. Why not give this housing back to the market and give it to students and young families? We have seen so far that Lisbon is going into the very good direction in that. And if I'm rightly informed, through my knowledge, already through giving a lot of Airbnbs back to the regular market, the rent prices have been decreasing. This is good news, ladies and gentlemen. So let's use these former Airbnb for housing for our young people and young families. Last but not least, I have been member of the EU Partnership for Affordable Housing. We have been writing over 3 years an action plan for affordable housing all over Europe. This action plan, I think, is the most progressive document that we have so far at European level. And it is completely in line also with the initiative report Kim Van Sparrentak now managed to bring through the parliament with a large majority. And I may say that was not easy. We managed to do this by, Kim, may I say it, by getting the abstention of the conservative parties. This is why we made the majority. Good. So we have this European Action Plan for Affordable Housing. We are ready to advise. We would love to advise the Portuguese government. We would love to advise all the cities that are interested, because this is part of the EU urban agenda. We want to strengthen the cities because the cities are in charge of providing most of the housing. So we need to strengthen their role. And we would be happy if we make a start. With big pleasure, we have seen that the Portuguese Presidency is inviting to a conference on affordable housing on the 25th of May. We do think this is a very crucial date, and we would be happy to support you in this and tell you more of our ideas. I have many, many more, but time is short, but perhaps there is another possibility for exchange. So thanks again. Hope to see you again. And again, all the best to our friends from Lisboa. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Bárbara, pela tua intervenção. Eu não quero...
Thank you very much, Barbara. I don't want to break the protocol, Eleni, so you forgive me, but I think that it would be important to hear the Secretary of State, because I know that Dr. Medina has to leave at 7. That's what we have been informed about. I've managed to reschedule things, but I would still rather hear what you have to say, and then at the end I could answer, and I would say maybe ask a couple of questions later. Thank you. Okay, that's lovely. Thank you very much, Secretary of State. And so now I would like to give the floor to the Leilani Faro, who was former rapporteur for the United Nations for the right to housing, and she's the overall director of SHIFT, which is an initiative in the movement related to the right to housing. You have the floor, Leilani.
Thank you so much. And like the people who spoke before me, I want to say a very happy 97th anniversary to the Tenants Union. I have to say it's much happier for me to be celebrating that today versus the other celebration, which is not a celebration at all, but the 1-year marker of the pandemic that has been so tragic and difficult for so many people across the world. So I'm happy to be here and celebrating in some sense, rather than having to reflect on this very difficult 1 year that we've had. As you know, I was the UN rapporteur between 2014 and 2020 for 6 years. And in 2016, I had occasion to visit Portugal on an official visit. And so I have some familiarity with what's some of the most urgent housing issues. Barbara provided such an incredible overview. So I feel like my comments might work quite well with what she just outlined for you. What I thought I would focus on is why it's so important, as Kim said, to move forward to address the housing crisis in Portugal and globally using human rights. And Kim knows, because she wrote her paper, the paper, in consultation with many others, that to say that housing is a human right doesn't just, it's not just like a rallying cry, everyone has the right to housing. Quite the opposite. And it's actually a very useful framework and an incredible foundation that helps you think through what is required of you as government to move forward and ensure access to affordable, secure, and adequate housing for everyone. And in fact, Barbara provided us with such an incredible outline that I can use what Barbara said and show you how everything she said completely is in line with a human rights approach, and in fact required by a human rights approach. First of all, I want to say that, in my opinion, it completely changes how most governments have viewed people, because a human rights approach makes people rights holders. And so when government is addressing homelessness or dealing with evictions or trying to curb financialization, they're not doing it because they're nice or because they want to do acts of charity. You do it because it is your obligation as government to the people who are rights holders. So it completely changes the frame, and that's very, very important. And without that understanding that every time you do something that is progressive to help tenants, to help homeless people, that you're not doing that because you're nice. You're not, even if it is nice, and it is nice, you're not even doing it just because of a social contract. You're doing it because of law, international human rights law that you have committed yourself to. And that gives you, it shouldn't be felt as like difficult or like a thorn in the side. It should be experienced as, I'm government and I'm meeting my obligations to my people. It's a nice thing. It's a good thing. It's not, in the neoliberal era, it was considered bad because government was bad. Government shouldn't be involved. I think we have moved well beyond that now. I think the pandemic has blown open how important it is that we move well beyond those neoliberal ideas. And I know the government of Portugal agrees with me on that, and agreed with me on that way back in 2016, in fact. So if I run through some of the things that Barbara mentioned, I can just tell you that what she was saying are, in fact, your human rights obligations. So for example, and Kim as well was talking about ending homelessness. And in Kim's paper, it was really a push. We must commit to ending homelessness by 2030. Well, the reason the paper says that is because homelessness is, of course, a prima facie violation of the right to housing. In other words, there's no way to look at homelessness as anything but the failure of governments to implement the right to housing. And so for that reason, it has to be addressed as an urgent and priority matter. And in keeping with human rights, we have to set measurable goals and timelines to ensure that we can do this, that we can end homelessness. And so 2030 is a good marker. It's consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, and offers, as Kim said, this incentive. And that is exactly what has motivated Finland. And Finland is trying to beat its own record. It's saying, they committed, I think, to ending homelessness by 2030, but now they know they can do it by 2027, for example. So the issue of evictions that Barbara raised, and she said very firmly, and I loved this, no evictions into homelessness. Well, now you know why. Because homelessness is a prima facie violation of the right to housing. So you can't have people being evicted into homelessness. That's just unacceptable. It is a gross violation of the right to housing. The issue of inadequate conditions. Under international human rights law, it's very clear that housing has to be adequate, and adequate has 7 characteristics that are well defined. I won't go into all of those characteristics because it's a little bit boring and tedious, but Barbara gave the example of energy poverty. Obviously, housing has to be warm enough for the people who are residing in it. When electricity is so expensive and heat is so expensive, then it risks people are risking being evicted or having to leave their homes. And so that obviously is problematic from a human rights point of view. You can also analyze empty homes from a human rights framework. The human rights framework tells you must do something with empty homes, because under international human rights law, there is an obligation that every government shall use the maximum of its available resources to implement the human right. So if you allow homes to stand idle, then we can ask, are you using the maximum available resources? That's an empty home. You have a supply problem in terms of social housing, and you have for many, many years now. Clearly, you're not maximizing your available resources if you're not doing something with those idle homes or those vacant homes. So that gives you a sense that what I'm trying to convey to you is how practical the human rights framework is, and how it provides you with the foundation that you need to do all of those things that Barbara recommends and that are contained in Kim's report that she outlined. I'll just add a few more things that I like about the human rights approach. It is holistic in nature, and I think that's what Kim was getting at in her comments. It says that you have to look at outcomes, and it doesn't matter that a policy or a law falls under the Ministry of Finance. It may have an impact on people's housing. So for example, you have in Portugal a golden visa program. Now I know the golden visa program is being revamped, but it's still in place for a little while longer in its old form. Well, the golden visa program is not considered part of your housing program. Huh? It's quite separate, and it came about as one of the ways in which to deal with a situation of a recession and economic instability. It was viewed in Portugal. This is not unique to Portugal. This is very common in many countries, the golden visa. But what you have to understand is that a program or a policy over there that seems like it has something to do with, economic well-being can have a direct impact on housing. And I know that the government of Portugal has seen that, which is why you've changed the program so that it can no longer allow for the eating up of real estate in Lisbon, for example, in city center, et cetera. So only to say that we have to be very careful that we don't view, when we're adopting a human rights approach, we don't view things narrowly in the area of housing. It's much broader than that. We have to look at fiscal policy, monetary policy, tax laws, as well as all of those things that are more traditionally understood as coming under the umbrella of housing. And the other thing a human rights approach requires is that all levels of government really work, including with regional government, really work together in sync. And the idea is that all governments have international human rights responsibilities, whether you're the city government, whether you're the national government, or whether you're a regional government. And that it will require, because this is a crisis just like climate change, it will require really positive interaction between all those levels of government. We absolutely cannot leave this to municipalities. We know that municipalities don't have the resources or capacity to deal with this global housing crisis. So many of the actors that are involved here are global actors, big finance, big capital. It's very difficult for cities to keep these actors at bay. And I see that Saskia has joined us, and I'm sure she will talk about those actors because she is the one who educated me so much in what I know about this issue of financialization. I have one final point, and it's only that what a human rights approach requires, and this is the piece that often gets missed, and it's the most difficult and uncomfortable piece for governments, but I'm going to put it to you. It really requires accountability. So there's monitoring mechanisms that are required, and that's, making sure you're on track to build more social housing, to avail yourselves of vacant homes, to end homelessness. You need to monitor those things. But you also need mechanisms to be held accountable so that people who are experiencing difficulties, systemic barriers to housing, have a way to let the government know that they are having those experiences, that there are still systemic barriers. There is no better way for governments to understand what the systemic challenges are, no better way than by hearing from the people who are experiencing those barriers themselves. And I am not talking only about courts. Courts is one way, but in Canada, for example, which is where I'm resident, the government decided they weren't so comfortable with setting up a whole sort of opening up our constitution and our charter. It would be very complicated. But what they did was they made provisions to appoint a federal housing advocate. And their job is to act as an independent ombuds almost, to hold the government accountable. And they can even host, strike a panel that's quasi-judicial, quasi-adjudicative, and that panel can review the systemic issue that the housing advocate thinks needs further investigation. So there's lots of different models out there. Of course, I've traveled the world, I've seen them all. Lots of things can work. But it's really important to hold yourself accountable and to not feel that is somehow bad. It's a really good thing to hold yourself accountable. You should want, as government, to be held accountable so that you can succeed. Thank you so much. I hear you, Saskia.
Professor Saskia Sassen is already in the mood. Welcome, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let me present to all the Portuguese public and the international public audience that is seeing us. I mean, there's no words needed to explain who Professor Saskia Sassen is, but she's a sociologist, very known, one of the most important names that we have in the contemporaneity about urban studies. Her analysis on the urban phenomenon in our days is incredible. It's one of the most quotable all over the world. Professor Saskia Sassen studies the role of cities in our humanity for decades now. She's actually a professor in Columbia University and visitor professor in London School of Economics. Of course, Professor, the floor is yours, and can you give us a frame, a critical frame about the actors and the stakeholders involved in the major forces that we are dealing nowadays that shape urban landscape? Can you give us a frame of it? Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. The floor is yours.
Well, yes. Can you hear me? It's my pleasure to be here. I really liked what Farah was saying, but you can hear me, yes? Can you hear me?
Yes, Professor.
Yes. Okay, great. That's all. I'm very good. So one way of thinking, and I completely agree with everything that she said, but one way of thinking about it is that we have moved into a new phase of capitalism. And it's a brutal one, because capitalism, say, after World War II, was a sort of more or less reasonable capitalism, of course, with massive inequalities. But there was also an attempt, a lot of housing was built for low-income people, et cetera, et cetera. There was a real recognition that our advanced economies needed to protect the disadvantaged. It was never perfect, but it worked. It made a difference. What is stunning about the current moment, and the current moment really begins 20 or 30 years ago, it didn't start yesterday, is the brutality of this mode of capitalism. It is, again, it's very different from the post-World War II period. When we all had to work together, there was a real sense of community, of enabling. That is gone. Now, one element in play in this transformation, I think, is the rise of a new type of rich class. Not the rich who had been rich for a very, very long time, etc., and hence, they were more gentle, if you want. No, this is like the emergence of barracuda type of people who want it all. They want to be dominant. There is never enough. You want more and more and more. So it is really a new kind of rich class that is truly aggressive and grabbing. And so the question for us is, how do we begin to really understand this transformation in a way that allows us to use new types of instruments to make this battle about housing, the rights of people to housing. And I think what Farah has been doing, in that whole project is amazing. It really brings to the fore some of the core elements. You just need 25 minutes of her speaking, and you will understand what the housing question actually is today, because it is different than it was after World War II. And I am afraid that a lot of nice people who really want to help see still the post-World War II mode, which went on for 30 and 40 years, which really was a nice mode. It worked. There was an enabling housing was built for the poor, etc., etc. Now, once we accept that what we're dealing with today is really foundationally different from what it was in the decades after World War II, say the 30 or 40 decades after World War II, then we confront a challenge. And I think here, with where Farah's analysis really becomes important, because it marks that difference. Let's remember, and we cannot forget that, and we must repeat that over and over, like I'm doing right now, just repeating it. To what extent the housing question has changed. Most people say the average person in the Americas, maybe not in France or whatever, maybe not in some other, but certainly in the Americas. But the average person thinks that it is the same story as after World War II. Those 30, 40 years after World War II. It is not. It is a radically changed condition. So we have barracuda investors who are interested in capturing even the big housing complexes of very, very modest people. But this is something that 30 years ago would not have made sense if you were rich and you had your options. But today it is, because it simply is transformed. It ceases being about housing. It is about assets. It's about materialities. It doesn't matter what their shape is, that can be bought and sold many times the same day. So now that then tells you that it's not that these who are grabbing the housing question, they're not interested in housing. Housing is a conditionality. It's a materiality. That's probably the better way, the clearer way to say it. It's a materiality. So you know what? You go for it. In the same way that they're capturing all kinds of other markets for food, for this, for that, that in the past would not have been of interest. Once we see it that way, we understand that the battle for housing is not simply getting access to housing. It is also about making sure that every citizen understands that there is a third actor, an invisible actor, and it's called high finance. And they are right now the extractors. They're the ones that extract. They extract all kinds of things, including housing. Is it modest housing? Is it bad quality housing? Is it high quality housing? It doesn't matter. All of that. Why? It's assets. What we see as housing, what we might see as, all kinds of very material conditions, for them is basically an instrumentality that via algorithmic mathematics is transformed into something. It just doesn't matter what it is. I really think that at some point, even shit, if I may say the word, can be transformed in a version of an asset. I mentioned this just to enable an audience to understand what we're talking about. This is not a selective operation. This is a brutal frontal observation that whatever materiality is there can be used to extract new types of advantages via very complex, mind you, and admirable algorithmic mathematics. I will just leave it at that. Is that okay?
Professor, it's perfect. It's perfect.
So brilliant, Saskia.
I think it was very accurate, very pertinent and objective. Very interesting, Professor. If you can join us until the end of the session, it's more 45 minutes, it would be a pleasure.
I will try to hang in. I am with family here. I'm surrounded by family who haven't seen me in a long time.
Okay, so
but I will try to hang in.
Time.
Yeah,
okay,
I'm very
thank
interested.
You so much, Professor.
Yes,
thank
bye-bye.
you. Thank you. Daria agora a palavra à Paula Marques, vereadora
then pass the floor to Paula
da
Marques.
habitação.
She's a councillor.
Peço desculpa, tenho aqui o inglês.
I'm really sorry because I was speaking on the wrong channel, says Luis. So I'd like to welcome Paula Marques. She's also an icon, defender of best practices. She's a councillor for housing at the Lisbon City Council since 2013. She's a part of the movement Citizens for Lisbon. She was elected as an independent in the list of the Socialist Party. She's also the president of the Portuguese Association Municipal Housing since 2018. So it's a great pleasure to have Paula with us. Now, tell us, Paula, what is the role that local authorities, and namely the City Council of Lisbon, can play in this process of welcoming these, receiving these recovery funds from the European Union and to transfer these into housing. Thank you very much for being with us. Thanks, Luís. And I'd like to thank you all and thank AIL and to congratulate AIL on its almost 100th anniversary. And in the years where I've been dealing with housing, AIL has been a constant partner. From my personal experience, I say that many of the things that we have been achieving, and in particular in public policies of housing in Lisbon, it comes from the calls for attention of AIL. AIL has a political vision on housing, but also a high level of initiatives. It is essential. Let me say that in the most difficult situations, in particular in supporting tenants who are victims of bullying, of forced evictions, a non-renewal of leases, and sometimes many families who do not know how to react and don't have judicial support. AIL has been extraordinary in the support and has been a partner of the City Council in supporting these residents who sometimes come to the City Council and ask for some support. So the association has been extraordinary in their support. So allow me to congratulate AIL and to leave this testimonial. I really like when AIL calls the attention for these problems because it helped us find the right way to go. Thank you very much, Luís and Romão, and allow me to thank you in this forum. I'd like to greet the remaining speakers of this panel. I confess that it's a great pleasure to be in a panel where the overwhelming majority are women. And for me, this is very, very significant. Only a couple of days after the International Women's Day, and one of the things which is really very important, sometimes we have to repeat so often how important women are to fight women's invisibility. So it's very good to have a high-level discussion panel with women, mostly. Having said this, in relation to several topics which have been discussed, and in particular, what Kim said regarding the report, besides we have taken note of the questions which were enhanced, for me it's very clear that if it's not the public power that guarantees a right to housing, it will not be the market who will do that. The market not only does not guarantee right to housing, but sometimes the market are even opposing the right to housing, and sometimes markets are discriminatory. This is a fact. So I'm not even bringing my opinion. This is a fact. And it's the state and public power that should guarantee the right to housing. And there's many ways of attaining this. Barbara made several references to situations that can be overcome with some proposals. I have a couple of provocative questions to put. For instance, if you were in my shoes, how would you go about this? But let me say quite clearly, it's the public powers who have this role. It's the best way of regulating the market. It's having more public houses. Portugal only has 2% and Portugal 7%. So it's not enough. It's nearly not enough for what we believe is a true guarantee of justice and equity in access to housing, guaranteeing no discrimination access to housing. This is a basic human right, not being discriminated in access to housing, and only a public rules in access to housing defend this right. Additionally, there is a good way of regulating the market. The more public housing we have, with more controlled prices, the greater influence we can have on the market. And why I'm talking about the market so much? For a very simple reason: the fact that I defend that once and for all we have to take away the right to housing from the market. It doesn't mean that we ignore it. We can increase the public housing and change public policies, but if we do not have ways of regulating the housing market, we will not attain our goals. So we can't ignore that. We're living in a market economy. We can criticize it, but this is a fact. We live in a market economy, and we have to find ways of moving and defending our rights within this market economy. To deal with housing policy, we have to take on board the regulation of financial investments and tax policy, particularly at national level, but also at a local level. Urban policies and city planning is essential to be developed in line with the housing policy. So only all these taken on board will be essential for us to attain our goal. As Marilinda said, we would love not to feel the need to have this discussion today. I confess that I don't consider that right to housing as the minor evil. No, it's quite the opposite. I believe that we should take initiatives because it's our obligation. It is a promotion of human rights, as Lailani said. We should strike a balance in cities in terms of balanced territories in terms of housing. I'd like to share my opinion on how we could attain this goal, this balance. It is an ongoing process which takes time. As Barbara was saying, we've been living through a period of great public construction in Portugal at the end of the 80s with the municipal plan, and in the 90s until the year 2000. Many houses were built. We took away from indecent living conditions thousands of families, but I don't think the social neighborhoods were the best solution in my view. Many of them are located in the peripheries. They are not inside cities. Questions of accessibility are not easy. It is true that we were living in an exceptional situation, so we had to eradicate thousands of shanty towns in the cities of Lisbon and Oporto, and this was the way we found of putting these families in decent houses. But I believe that we need something different, but in the same dimension. Of course, not in the same way. Today we deal with a question of non-integration and the ghettoization that the construction of this housing costs. So I believe that we must learn with the lessons from the past and we have to do things differently. So what can Lisbon do in particular regarding tenants? For many years, we focused on building houses for the most vulnerable groups of the population. We have to keep on doing this because of the current crisis. We're going to have a change of what we identified as most vulnerable families. What we now, the most vulnerable families are going to have to be re-identified because there are other vulnerabilities that we'll have to identify. And the diagnosis we have made is currently being revised. And adding up to this, there is low wages, precarious jobs, and also different living conditions that will make us rethink about our housing policies. And there's also the issue of energy poverty. In terms of public housing in Lisbon, we have been renovating the neighborhoods I was just mentioning earlier on, foreseeing some changes, foreseeing the fight of energy poverty. In the new construction, we are building differently from what we did in the 80s and 90s. We are building houses, public houses, and I say public because we are building public housing regardless of the social group we are addressing. We know that we have to provide housing to the most vulnerable families. We have informal housing, accessible rents, which was not important some 10 years ago, but today in Portugal is as important as what we have been living in the 90s. This crisis we have been living through, and which is becoming more and more difficult, has an impact on middle-income families. So this is our target population. So when we build or renovate houses, is to defend the right to housing. So when we do it, we don't build houses for middle income or low income. We are renovating or building to defend the right to housing, but it's not enough. The the action of the municipalities and local authorities is not enough, or even the central government initiative. We need another sector, and these are the sectors which, what Barbara says, social rental agencies. I would say that if we wanted to target a city which would be extremely well balanced in social and economic terms, if we look at a territory and we think of 1/3 of the housing, public housing, and we could have 1/3 of housing promoted by non-profit, private sector, like cooperative sector, and charitable organizations. And if we think in these 2/3 and finally 1/3 for the free market, we'd have 2/3 of houses covered by public funds and away from the market economy. And so these would give us some more contributions for what we think are healthy cities, because what we lack in Lisbon, in my view, is to have the 1/3 in the middle. We still build public houses. I believe that Recovery and Resilience Plan is a wonderful opportunity for us to have more public housing, both in renovation and in building new houses. Done very differently from what we did in the 90s, but we need more tools. we have the renovation under the Lisbon City Council, the building of new houses. We have the renovation of buildings from the central administration, which are now in the hands of the local authorities belonging to the Institute of Social Security. And this is where we are working with the central government, but we need more solutions. So the more solutions we have, the quicker we reach our goal. And the cooperative sector and the support of cooperative sector and the renewal of cooperative sector is essential, with one specificity, because we've learned with the errors from the past. We will have to, so there is no right to ownership in this cooperative sector. I think this is going to be very controversial, but this is the only way of guaranteeing that what was built or renovated with public funds, namely with the support of the recovery funds, will not be used as a financial asset, so will not go into speculation. So, yes, we need a new cooperative sector, which will promote the relations with the communities, and with exception of the right to ownership. Now, if we think about, well, I'm going to finish, but still make a final comment on short rental and the impact it has on cities. Lisbon, well, you know, there's been a change in law. The local authorities are now have some control over short rental. Lisbon has got a regulation. It regulates short rental. It defined the contention zones, particularly zones which were very burdened, both in terms of the price per square meter, particularly in the historical center, which were undergoing very advanced speculation. So we contained short rental in these areas. We did not allow new short rental permits, and now with the current situation and with the program Safe Rent, the attempt to take away from the short rental market some houses and will be put into accessible rents. We have a great demand from young families and a great demand from people who are not so young, who have problems with access to housing in middle-income families. So there is a try to take them away from short rentals and give them back into the rental market. It's a recent evolution. We hope that we will be successful. Until now, we have been able to take away some houses from the short rental market. We hope that we can go further. Still, I believe that, in my view, the great tool is the public housing. We have several ways of getting there, and I shared with you those which are more feasible. Two other questions which are a great concern to me, and I would like to have some big feedback from you. I would be very grateful. In the historical center, it's very problematic, these problems we've had in historical center. We had a neoliberal law of urban rentals, which evicted many families. As Barbara said, many families were evicted. So the AIL fought against this law. We protected the most vulnerable families, and I believe that it's not enough. We have to go further. And Lisbon put at disposal of these families which were about to be evicted some of our houses in the historical center, and we renovated this housing in these boroughs where people were being evicted, so they didn't have to move away from their neighborhood. But it's not enough. And I'm afraid, where I'm really convinced that there will be a similar situation to what we had in the past. When the moratoriums are over, we have a series of legal provisions that protect tenants which have lost their income. This period is now about to finish, so let's see what will happen next, because people lost their incomes and are going to have difficulties in paying the rent on one hand, and on the other hand, those which are indebted are going to be overburdened in their families. So it's very important to take away the level of indebtedness.
Mais uma vez, eu sei que é uma questão mais polémica.
And once again, I know it's a very polemic, very controversial situation. The Secretary of State and I have discussed this. I don't defend the subsidizing rents of families as a way of implementing the right to housing. But in a situation that we are living in, and given the situation that we're in, I think that we should consider temporary subsidies for people don't lose their homes. And that is one of the things we have to think about, is how are we going to act? Upstream or downstream? I can build thousands of public homes. So if I don't take into consideration the housing loss, and if I can't protect these families, then there can be a permanent transition from private to public without any upstream action to make sure that people do not lose their homes. So I think that temporary subsidies, I think, is important, and we are going to have a municipal rental subsidy as from April. So we have to go further. I've already shared some of the ways we're going. The two questions that I have to ask, which I'm concerned about, is that when we talk about the question of empty homes, of empty houses, and so we do have a responsibility on public housing. Marina Gonçalves from Central Administration and Municipal. We in Lisbon are trying to overcome these vacant, the situation of vacant houses and not being used in order to, and we want to put this at the service of the right to housing. Central Administration has done the same thing in relation to the municipalities. That is, for municipalities to be able to use essential administration property to be able to integrate it and increase our public stock. If you were in our situation, this is my question, what proposals would you make for us to be able to mobilize, and what instruments would be interesting to mobilize what you consider vacant homes? There can be private vacant homes, because public vacant homes we are responsible for putting them at the service of families. So what measures or what examples would you give? What contributions can you give us with instruments for us to be able to mobilize these private vacant houses? First question. Second question is, what would you do, and what would you suggest when you say that no family can be homeless when evicted? What do you suggest we do when we are faced with the situation of the eviction from a private home? These are the two questions that I'd like to leave you with, and I would like to thank you very much for this participation. And that we all have differences and difficulties, but we're on the same boat, and that is we want to implement this right to housing. Thank you very much, Paula, for your excellent intervention. Romain would also like to say something, just a small one. So let's hear Romain Levedinho, and then we'll hear the Secretary of State, and then we'll have a round of answers and no questions from the public. There is a question which has got to do with how we can actually implement this. This report is fantastic, but what specific measures, and the question that the public ask is, and this is just in line with what the Councillor Paula Max has mentioned, how we're going to implement all this. So we'll hear Paula Levedinho, Romain Levedinho, and then the Secretary of State. Thank you very much. Well, just a small contribution before we bring this initiative to a close. So for years, we have been talking about discussing the different problems that the report addressed, and now our participants once address. We believe that we're moving in the right direction. We have developed an initiative like the one that was approved here. That is, we're making a plea to the government to just like the private owners, that doesn't solve the problem. So the government has to do something. So I would like to thank you all, and I would like to thank you for the contribution that you've all given, and alert you of the problems that exist in our country, not only in Lisbon, Porto, and the whole country. And so I would like to leave you with my most sincere gratitude and say that I'm very happy and very satisfied to see what we have done for years and what we're going to continue to do. That is the Lisbon Tenants Association. Thank you very much, Romain. And now, Secretary of State, please. Thank you very much. Well, I would like to say that it's very important for us, but we all have the same objectives. So for us, it's important to know when the diagnosis to know what we're doing, but we have a number of concrete proposals, and Paula asked a number of questions that I would also like to ask. Once we have made the diagnosis, we have to find specific answers, and that's very complex, and we don't, me and Paula think the same way. I think the best answer, could you ask the Secretary of State to slow down, because it's very difficult to follow her at this speed. And so I would like to say, so, Secretary of State, the interpreters are asking you to speak a little bit slower, please. And so it's very difficult to follow. Thank you very much indeed. I'm from the north. I speak very fast, says the lady. So, Secretary of State. So I'm going to try and speak a little bit slower. So we have a medium-term objective, that is to mobilize our housing stock for these policies. That is that we have to a lot of what you don't do from one day to another. We have a short-term concern, that is the discussions of the differences that we have. Paula and I must be the only people have differed a little bit in the short-term solution because of the effect of the measures that have been taken in this in terms of the subsidies. But I would like to begin by looking at some of the things that we're saying, that we're not giving anything to anybody. And in fact, that is the real truth. And this is the basis of any discussion that we make about in terms of the right to housing. We cannot say, we cannot find, we can say, okay, great, congratulations, we've done something innovative in the promotion of public policies. No, we are doing something innovative, and we have been in the last 3 years, but we've only do what we should be doing. And so if we don't have housing responses for everybody, we shouldn't feel that we've done enough. Now, this is a constitutional right. That is the right to housing. It's the guarantee to rights, and so that is housing. It's the guarantee, is a base to guarantee public health, education, etc. And so we cannot see our task, in this case, political, but now task carried out by institutes as a right that we are assigning just for the sake of it, but no, it's a continuation of responsibility assigned to us. And so we're not doing anything new. We've created new rules, and that is the guarantee of human rights, and the guarantee of safeguarding housing is something that is has been for many decades in our constitution. And so we are going to carry on with our responsibility. It is very little. What we're doing now is very little in terms of diagnosis, but I'm not saying it's little because we want to, but in practical terms, it's very difficult to actually implement, that is in the short term, housing responses. And so with this, so I would now like to move on to, because Paul mentioned the municipal policies that are being promoted. And it's in central administration, we're also promoting these policies and the articulation between the different instruments that we have. And so we have a major priority, that is to strengthen the role of the state in the housing stock. And so we were talking about 5% a while ago. So this cuts across not only the central state housing stock, but the municipal housing stock. But we don't want to be left with 5%. Now, we want to assume this objective, that is to reinforce the public housing stock. And not as that is it's an objective of the present government because they decided that housing is a priority, but it's the responsibility of the state to guarantee what is the function of the state, that is to guarantee the right to housing. And if it's right that we think 5% is an ambitious objective, and we are working towards this, but because, as Paula would say, 5% isn't a third of the public housing that we need to guarantee. And so
mas fazendo aqui uma estratégia transversal.
We have to make a strategy that cuts across the country because it affects the whole country and the population. It is not a problem of the low-income classes or social problem, but it's it affects the whole population, and we should affect as a whole, and its right to housing affects everybody. And it's true that to say this is very easy, but to actually do this in practical terms is not so easy. Paul also talked about 3 priorities and 3 instruments. Well, our priorities with the PRR, we're going to have no interest loans, and so that is to 2026. This is a program that is focused on the identification of housing needs, for example, the more vulnerable groups, and introducing the questions of the homeless and the problems of inclusion and inclusion policies in the implementation of the right to housing. And through this first right program, and so it is the municipalities going to implement this program. So what we're going to do is we're going to reinforce the social housing promoted by the municipalities, and through this program that we're going to meet the needs of families with an average income. And so we have to think of private housing, so people with lower income, and so we have to promote, to overcome or to mitigate the questions of energy poverty, and we have to ensure that the housing is appropriate. And so this is the way, and appropriate conditions. So this is some of the work we're doing with the municipalities. And so if you ask me if the millions of euros is enough, I can say no, but I don't want you to see the PRR And as Barbara asked, is that enough? No, of course it's not enough. And so this is the major conclusion that this isn't enough, and we already knew this, but we are not basing our policies on the program for recovery and resilience. No, we have to be realistic enough to understand that we're not going to manage, and especially thinking about the market that we have until 2026, we're not going to do a lot more than the 26,000 homes. And so this is a plan that cuts across the whole country. And of course, this is the strategies that are going to be presented. The diagnosis obviously are going to be much higher than we identified at the beginning. And we have to guarantee the responsibility that we have to have as a state is to guarantee that we have to meet the needs of all situations identified in terms of the PRR or the financial plans from the state budgets or other community funds. But this is response is to give them. We have to give a response. That's our responsibility. So we have to give additional financial incentives to municipalities in order to implement these policies, because from a budgetary point of view, the funds have to go to municipality, but the PRR is fundamental, but it shouldn't be seen as the only financial instrument, and it should only be limited to rather we should take advantage of this plan in order to channel more funds for housing. And in terms of energy policy, in addition to what the instrument that we are going to create in this plan, there's a component that's got to do with energy efficiency, but there's 300 million for residential buildings. It is not our responsibility, it's the responsibility of the Ministry of Energy, but we divide our work, but this is going to complement the work that has already been done within the scope of first rights, and it has to be concerned about mitigating energy poverty, which obviously in Portugal is a reality and it's very present. And so these are the measures in the PRR that are going to allow us to mitigate the problems that we have. And no doubt this has to be ongoing work, and so it's. But of course, we do have the status obviously accountable. But the importance of trying to find housing models that are more inclusive, which is a concern that I have, because sometimes we focus a great deal. I'm talking about me. I'm talking about housing because that is my area. But it's important to have an intervention, articulated intervention of different areas. Maybe talk about different groups and the need for inclusion in society. The problem of inclusion in this society is not a problem of those who are not included in society. It's quite often a problem of the society in which they're going to be included as a social part for communities to make sure that we all are part of the community. And there's a number of groups. We're talking about those, the homeless. We could talk about the gypsy community. We could talk about the different discriminations that exist in the housing market, and our instruments, or the different instruments that we have is essential to have this integration and this coordinated work coordinated with other areas to guarantee inclusive housing, and not going to make the same mistakes that have been made in the past. And so we're going to resolve the problem of housing, and just housing, and then we don't resolve the problem of the right to housing, which is much just more than the physical aspect. And so this is a work that is not easy to carry out, just with most municipalities, because in Lisbon we work well together. In some places it's not easy to do, but it's part of the law, and so it's part of our programs. But talking about this question of inclusion of the more vulnerable groups of PRR, we have a fund, a small fund, because at the beginning of the work that we want to do in order to create an initial response to housing, and this from this logic, to meet immediate needs, for example. That is an eviction, for example, that we wouldn't expect to happen so often. And I know, for example, the municipalities end up by being the first door that people knock on. But the problems of a natural catastrophe, for example, a pandemic that happens, now those who are homeless who want immediate answers. And those who are victims of domestic violence, but there are a number of emergency situations, urgent situations, that we don't have an immediate answer to this. And so we want this instrument, are we going to create this instrument with the collaboration of the municipalities, but it's an instrument that I'm worried, I'm concerned about its implementation, but it can be an excellent and more important medium-term policy, but that is to bring these answers, housing answers together. These are the temporary ones, for example, because access to decent and affordable housing has been the basis of everything that we are doing. And so we must have a sort of temporary solution to meet urgent needs. And so we were surprised with the situation to somebody who was evicted, and the greatest frustration that we have and the greatest problem that we have that we don't have housing with solutions. And so we say, look, we don't have houses because it's our duty to find this solution. And so until we find instruments to guarantee these solutions, so then we are failing as governors and leaders, political leaders. And so we are going to create this subsidy, which worries about implementation, just like any instrument, new instrument that we're making, because it brings together many areas and many, and so there's going to be a great variety of people working together, and it's a new reality, but it can be a very useful instrument. But in the short term, Paul asked the question, so we have a great difficulty in the short term. Quite often we go to the social security and to try and find temporary solutions, but this is not an efficient, effective model as a whole, and it's a model that quite often leaves us with this feeling that we're not doing our work properly. And so there's a third dimension, and the report talks about, which is that is affordable rents. We have failed in social housing. There was always a policy for central and local governments to maintain housing, but there's a problem that goes beyond the solution given by the state, and that we found this and in Portugal. So we just thought, oh, the market will solve the housing problem, the housing problem for those with an average income. This actually doesn't happen, and this has already been said and re-said and said, and I totally agree with everything I heard. And so in terms of our market, that is most of our market, and so a market that doesn't want to help us in promoting the right to housing, but it we have additional problems in terms of with different types of taxation. So there's certain disparity, and we have to assume this is a speculative market because it is not made to give certain responses, and so we can't say it's a speculative market exists, and so we have to give this to the market to solve the problem. No, we have a certain responsibility. The market was advanced and it will move forward, and the state didn't do anything. And so there must be a public solution given by the state. So at the moment, we haven't got a response that can be given from one day to another. So we have been building a number of realities, and the PRR is a source of financing which is not enough for our objectives nor our priorities. Once again, I agree with Barbara and Romão's already said that the money that is in the PRR is not enough. It has the limits of investment, so we have to identify everything. So we have to do things realistically, and we are still working in listing the property, and we have to give additional funding to find a public solution. And I totally agree with what Paula Marx said. I defend the cooperative model, I believe. So as I said, so we want to create the second part of the intervention with affordable rents. And so, and in terms of the subsidies, we are going to move forward with a public tender, so allow part of our buildings can go to go to tender for cooperatives, and so they can promote affordable rents. And as Paula Marx said, so we have to keep the property in the hands of the state, and rents have to be affordable, and they cannot be left in the hands of random situations. So, and so this is our priority, and PRR and so it's such a great investment, but we must find solutions. We have to be realistic, and this is a very important step for our housing policies. It shouldn't be the only step.
So Paula put two questions, and I'm going to say something else. You talked about the model of subsidizing the market on a short-term basis. We've talked about this. Paula said that we have some difference of opinions. I have difficulty in accepting that the short-term model is a subsidy model. We have tax benefits, of course, which are needed to try and attract the private market into affordable rent. We have Porta 65, we have tax benefits from long-term rental, but they have not reached the thresholds we desire. We only talk about 10,000 contracts, less than 400 contracts of affordable rents. So we have other programs, but we need to scale up. So I'd like to ask on a short term, what tools can we create besides the ones that we have discussed? What tools can be created to promote the housing? I'd like to conclude by thanking these wonderful inputs, this panel, which was very interesting. But this is the challenge for us, so that you can help us out in future for our work. Thank you very much, Secretary of State. I'm passing the floor to Kim to conclude. Kim is in a hurry, of course, and we're all in a hurry, in fact, because we are over the time. So I'd like to ask you for a very brief comments to Kim, to Professor Sarski that you know would like to address us, and Barbara to just make some concluding remarks. Kim, you have the floor. How can we really put into practice the right to housing? What practical measures?
Well, I think we've already heard so many examples tonight. Actually, I don't know if I can recall all of them in a short speech, but I think the first step really is acknowledging the right to housing and acknowledging that this is not something, as Leilani said, you just have to say, but you have to work. You have to work. You have to put in policies, and you have to take action to ensure the right to housing for everyone. And, as was said, it's not a nice to do thing, but it's something, fundamentally important for our societies and our people to thrive. So I think that is the first step. If we then look at what we can really do, I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge that we really need to invest in social housing, and we really need to make sure that that investment is possible and it's not being restrained by very restrictive EU regulations. And next to that, I think it's very important that we are much more stringent on these very big corporations, the barracuda investors, as Saskia called them, to really just not accept it anymore, that they are just using our housing stock as a way to make profit and kicking people out on the streets. So I think working on this investment, and in combination of working on making sure that also housing corporations and municipalities can actually access buying already existing housing stock, and we don't only have to rely on newly built housing, which we know will take a longer time. I think is a very good first step and a very important combined effort that we have to take. And of course, we have to set a goal to end homelessness.
Okay, Kim, thank you so much for the short answer. Very interesting. Professor Saskia Sassen, do you want to say something, please, in reply to what the Deputy Paula Marques and the Secretary of State, Marina Gonçalves, said about how can we promote this right to housing in an effective way? What measures would you say that we must take? Professor? Deixem-me só verificar se a professora recebeu o meu...
Apparently, Professor Saskia is no longer with us. Well, if she comes back, she will... Well, then to you, Barbara.
What kind of very concrete measures can we take? Please.
Yes, thank you again for giving me the word, and thank you for all those questions. I think this is such a vivid dialogue, and what we see from today is that we can only learn from each other by exchange, open exchange, finding new ideas and places. So very shortly, Paula, you told me, what can we do about this vacancies, empty houses in the cities? What can we do? Well, I'm coming from the revolutionary city of Berlin, where 85% of the people choose to be tenant, because it's quite okay to be a tenant there, because there is a lot of protection and security of tenure. What we did with speculative vacancies, we set in force a very strict misappropriation law for certain quarters, especially in the inner city center. I think this is analog to the Lisbon situation, because it's in the Centro Storico. So we had the following proposal. If there is speculative vacancy, we fine the landlord. If the landlord is just not able to renovate the house because it is in a bad status, then we give a loan from our green energy efficiency funds. We help to renovate, but as a return, we want the allocation rights for this house. And then we put people into these apartments. It's working very well. And I can tell you that we do not have empty apartments in the city center of Berlin anymore. And we had a lot of speculative vacancies. Second question to Marina. What can we do with those problems of really making the private sector taking up the goals of the Portuguese government to deliver more affordable housing? Crucial question. I think a very good measure is a very good and to the point zoning law. When you say, in this area, I apply a zoning law where I do want to have a quota of 50 to 75% housing, social housing and affordable housing, both, also for the middle incomes. And then you say, everybody can do these houses, also the private sector, but if the private sector is doing it, this has to be done with clear rent caps, which are unlimited. And as we all know, investment in real estate, and this is of course the story that Saskia Sassen told us, in these days, it is so interesting. And even if you invest in social and affordable housing, you have average profits between 3 and 4%. This is a lot in these times. So I do think with clear rules and obligations for the private sector, you can really mobilize them to invest. And I think 3% is actually enough. We do not need more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And deixem-me fazer então comentário final.
Let me make a final comment. Please don't leave us yet. Just to say that I was very pleased to moderate this session on behalf of AIL. It was a great honor for us to have these guest speakers. Before making some final thanks, I'd like to say some final remarks. Right to housing has been distance from the idea of room and height. It has been considered as a financial asset. We have to fight these under all international and national regulations. We have to affirm the idea of basic human right to housing, which is unconditional, so universal. And this can be done through the strengthening of a strong welfare state with an ability not just of promoting, but also monitoring housing. And this implies, and the Secretary of State said, and is unanimous from all our speakers, this implies a massive investment in the public housing, not just through new buildings, but also trying to mobilize empty houses, renovate them and bring them into the public sector. The Recovery and Resilience Plan, which will allow to allocate these European funds to Portugal, is going to be an incredible opportunity. And we believe that we really have to pay attention, because the public housing models that can be developed, they should take on board the rental. So the rental market has to be mobilized, and AIL has been defending for many years, and you have welcomed our changes in the public sessions that we've had with you. We need a new rental regulation which completely replaces the law of 2012. Only thus will we render compatible supply and demand in the rental market, which does not work at national level. Through this new law, we could in fact consolidate a very important sector, which would be attractive even for the private sector. It's been a great honor to have you with us. It will be a great opportunity if we could be invited as partners, civil society partners, to be present in the social summit on the 7th of May in Oporto. Secretary of State, it would be a unique opportunity to bring together the civil society representatives of AIL and international institutions to sign this very important declaration of the social pillar. Let me say that this discussion had the goal of stressing these very important opportunities that the initiative report gave us and what these can represent for the Portuguese presidency of the European Council and for the future of the right to housing of the several EU member states. Let me thank to all of those who were listening and watching, both national and internationally, but also to our guest speakers. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much for participating, and a special word of thanks for the technical team, namely the interpreters, and in logistics, and the technical staff. Thank you very much, you all, and we will try to attain the goal of right to housing for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Obrigada.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Obrigado.
Cheers.